"She's the one nobody wanted," a woman whispered loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Look at her standing there alone with nothing but a suitcase." Clara Whitmore did not cry. She did not beg. She had traveled 2,000 miles on the promise of a man who couldn't even show his face to reject her, and she was still standing. Every man in Red Hollow had already looked away. Every man except one. Elias Carter stood across the street watching a woman the town had written off before she'd spoken a single word, and felt something he hadn't felt in 6 years crack open inside his chest. He didn't know her name yet, but he already knew one thing with absolute certainty. This woman was not unwanted. She was simply waiting for a man wise enough to see her. Subscribe to our channel and follow their story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city are you watching from. I want to see exactly how far this love story has traveled. The stagecoach had been 12 days on the road from Richmond, Virginia to the Montana Territory, and Clara Whitmore had spent every one of those days rehearsing the same quiet prayer. Let me be enough. Whatever I find when I get there, let me be enough for it. She wasn't a woman given to fantasy. She had learned early in life that hope was only useful if you kept it small and practical, the way you'd keep a candle burning in wind-cupped, close-sheltered, never too bright. Her mother had taught her that. Her father's long illness had confirmed it, and the years she'd spent watching other women her age marry and build families while she stayed home changing medicine bottles and reading scripture aloud to a man who sometimes didn't recognize her face anymore. Those years had carved something permanent into the center of her. She was 31 years old. She was not a girl. She did not arrive in Red Hollow with stars in her eyes. She arrived with a single leather suitcase, a family Bible with a broken spine, $43 folded inside her left boot, and the letter she'd read so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. "Dear Miss Whitmore, I am a ranch owner of reasonable means and honest character, seeking a woman of practical temperament and steady heart, to share my life and work alongside me in the Montana Territory. I am not a poet and will not pretend otherwise, but I offer you a real home fair treatment and the chance to build something that lasts." His name was Gerald Holt. He had written her 4 letters over 3 months. He had never once mentioned her appearance, and she had taken that as a good sign. When the stagecoach pulled into Red Hollow on a Tuesday afternoon in July of 1886, Clara gathered her bag and stepped down into a wall of summer heat and dust. The town was alive around her, horses tied to posts, men moving between the general store and the saloon, women in groups of 2 and 3, talking near the dressmaker's window. Children chasing a dog through the narrow gap between buildings. She stood on the edge of all of it and looked for Gerald Holt. She looked for 5 minutes, then 10. A man near the post office caught her eye, heavy-set 50 or so, a decent hat, and she started toward him. He looked at her, looked away. She stopped walking. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm looking for Gerald Holt. Do you know him?" The man shifted his weight. He didn't quite meet her eyes. "Gerald. Sure I know Gerald. He was supposed to meet my stage. I've come from Virginia. My name is Clara Whitmore." Something moved across the man's face. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition of something he'd already been told about and wasn't sure how to handle. "Right," he said. "Right, well. Gerald, he asked me to pass along his regrets." Clara's hands tightened around the handle of her suitcase. "I see. He said to tell you the arrangement wouldn't be going forward. Said something came up." "Something came up," she repeated. "That's what he said." She waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. "Thank you for telling me," Clara said, and because she was her mother's daughter and her father's caretaker, and a woman who had survived worse mornings than this one, she kept her voice completely steady when she said it. She turned around and walked back to where the stagecoach driver was unloading the last of the luggage. That was when she became aware of the watching. It wasn't anything dramatic. Nobody was staring openly. But she could feel it the way you feel weather changing, a shift in the air, a stillness where there had been movement, conversations dropping half a note lower. She had become something to observe. The woman from Virginia who had come all this way and been left standing on a street with her suitcase. The rejected bride. She heard it first, from two women near the milliner's shop, talking behind their hands, but not really trying to be quiet about it. That's her. The mail-order one. Gerald turned away. He saw her coming off the stage and sent Barker over to, well, you know. She doesn't look like much, does she? Clara did not turn her head. She set her suitcase down beside the stagecoach wheel, pressed one hand flat against the side of it to steady herself, and breathed. She was not going to cry on a public street in a town where she knew no one. That was simply not going to happen. You need somewhere to go, miss, the stagecoach driver, a weathered man named Perkins, who'd talked to her exactly twice during the 12-day journey, both times to warn her about bumps in the road, was looking at her with something careful and uncomfortable on his face. I'll manage, Clara said. There's a boarding house on Milner Street. Mrs. Crane runs it. She's decent enough. Thank you. She picked up her suitcase and walked. She was halfway across the main street when she heard a third voice, this one not bothering to lower itself at all. Gerald told me she looked like she'd been working fields her whole life, said her hands were rough as a farmhand's. Laughter. Not loud, but clear. Clara kept walking. She found Mrs. Crane's boarding house without asking for directions again because she wasn't going to give anyone in this town the satisfaction of watching her struggle. The room she rented was small and clean, with a window that looked out over the alley behind the building, and a bed with a quilt so thin she could see light through it. She sat on the edge of that bed for a long time. She thought about Gerald Holt, who had never met her, and had somehow already decided she wasn't worth meeting. She thought about the 4 letters she'd kept tied with a piece of ribbon still packed in the outside pocket of her suitcase. She thought about the $43 in her boot, and what they would and wouldn't cover. She thought about Virginia and her father's house, which had been sold to pay his debts after he passed, and the cousin who'd let her stay for 2 months before making it clear she'd overstayed her welcome. She had no place to go back to. This was the only direction there was. She opened her suitcase. She took out her Bible and set it on the nightstand. She smoothed the quilt flat with both hands, a practical gesture, something to do while her mind worked. I suppose I will have to build a life without being chosen, she thought. It wasn't self-pity. It wasn't even grief exactly. It was the calm, hard-edged recognition of a woman who had spent her adult life adjusting to circumstances she hadn't created and couldn't control. She had done it before. She would do it again. In the morning, she would start looking for work. She didn't know because she couldn't have known that she had been seen. Not the way the town had seen her, not as a spectacle, not as a cautionary tale, not as the punchline to whatever story Gerald Holt had been telling his friends. But truly seen in the way that matters. Elias Carter had been coming out of the bank when the stagecoach arrived. He'd had no reason to pay particular attention to it. He had his own business to think about, a quarterly account ledger that had been giving him headaches for a week. For a week, a conversation with the bank manager that had gone better than expected, but still left him with a sour feeling in his gut. He'd been crossing the street when he noticed the small group of people near the post office, and then the woman standing apart from them, with her leather suitcase, and the man Barker walking over to her with that look on his face. The look of someone delivering bad news. He'd been handed by someone else, and didn't particularly want to be holding. Elias stopped. He watched Gerald Holt's message get delivered. He watched the woman receive it. He watched her face from across the street, and he couldn't have told you why he was watching, except that there was something about the way she stood, the absolute stillness of it, the way she didn't reach for the man's arm, or step back, or look around for somewhere to run, that kept his feet from moving. She turned and walked back to the stagecoach. She sat on the step of it for a moment with one hand against the wheel. She got up and picked up her suitcase and crossed the street. She passed within 20 feet of Elias Carter. She did not look at him. She was looking straight ahead, at a point somewhere past the milliner's shop, and her jaw was set in a way that said she was holding something in. Not tears. He didn't think something harder than tears, and her hands were steady on the suitcase handle, even though he could see the knuckles were white. He heard one of the women near the shop say something. He heard the laughter. He watched Clara Whitmore walk through it without breaking stride. He didn't move for a long moment after she'd passed. Elias Carter was not a man who'd given much thought to love since the winter he'd buried his wife Margaret at the age of 32. 6 years of running a cattle ranch alone had organized him into something efficient and contained. He worked hard. He treated his men fairly. He ate whatever Rosario, his cook, made without complaint, and he didn't invite the world into whatever space was left over inside him after the work was done. He was not a man who told people about his feelings. He was not a man who had feelings he couldn't account for. So he couldn't quite explain what it was that he carried home with him that evening after completing his business in town. Why he thought about the woman with the leather suitcase while he rode back to the ranch, or why the image of those white knuckles stayed with him longer than it had any right to. He told himself it was just the fundamental wrongness of the thing, the indecency of it. A man inviting a woman across the country and then not showing up to face her. That was what bothered him, he decided. It was about decency. That was all. He found out her name the next morning from Barker himself, who seemed to feel guilty enough about his errand the day before that he was telling anyone who'd listen that it hadn't been his idea. Gerald Holt never did have the spine for difficult conversations, Barker said to no one in particular at the counter of the general store. Sends me to do his dirty work, and now I've got to look at my own face in the mirror. Where is she staying? Elias asked. Barker looked at him. Mrs. Crane's, I think. Why? Does she have work? How would I know that? Elias bought his supplies and left. He thought about it for 2 days. Not constantly. He had cattle to manage and fencing to check, and a dispute between 2 of his hands to mediate. But in the background, the way you're aware of a stone in your boot, even when you're not thinking directly about it. On the 3rd day, he went to Mrs. Crane's boarding house. Mrs. Crane answered the door with the particular expression of a woman who had seen enough of life to be unimpressed by most of it. I'm looking for Clara Whitmore, Elias said. She's in the back garden, Mrs. Crane said, fixing my fence, which I didn't ask her to do and can't pay her for. He found Clara kneeling in the narrow strip of ground behind the boarding house, working a loose fence post back into the earth with her bare hands and a flat-headed rock she'd clearly been using as a hammer. She had her sleeves rolled up, and her hair was coming loose from its pins, and she was talking quietly to herself, or maybe to the fence post, in a tone that suggested she had opinions about the quality of its original construction. She looked up when she heard his boots on the dirt. She looked at him without particular expression. Can I help you? My name is Elias Carter, he said. I own the Carter Ranch about 4 miles north of town. I heard you might be looking for work. Something shifted in her face. Not hope exactly. More like careful calculation. Who told you that? Nobody told me anything specific. I drew my own conclusions. She sat back on her heels and looked at him the way someone looks at a thing they're trying to assess without giving away that they're assessing it. What kind of work? Household management. Bookkeeping if you have the skill for it. My ranch runs well, but my accounts are a disaster, and my house has been running itself for 6 years, which means it isn't really running at all. He paused. Room and board included, and fair wages. Clara was quiet for a moment. Why are you offering this to me specifically? She said. There must be women in this town who'd want that work. There probably are, Elias said. But I'm asking you. She looked at him steadily. Mr. Carter, I want to be clear about something before we discuss this further. I am not looking for a situation that carries expectations I'm not aware of. I've just had an unpleasant education in what happens when a man says one thing and means another. Elias met her eyes. I'm offering you work, he said. That's what I'm offering. Nothing else is implied and nothing else will be asked. Another silence. Longer. I can keep accounts, Clara said. I managed my father's business affairs for the last 4 years of his life. I can also cook, and I can run a household, and as you can see. She glanced at the fence post. I'm not afraid of practical work. I can see that. And I want it understood that I will not be treated as a charity case. I will do the work, and I expect to be paid for it the same as anyone else you'd employ. That's exactly how it would work, Elias said. Clara stood up. She brushed the dirt from her hands against the sides of her skirt. She looked at him one more time, that same steady calculating look, and then she nodded. All right, she said. When would you need me to start? Tomorrow morning, if that suits you. It suits me, Elias nodded. He turned to go, then stopped. He looked back at her. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Yes." "What you said yesterday, when you were standing in the street." She went very still. "I didn't say anything in the street." "You said it to yourself," he said. "I was close enough to hear." Her expression was unreadable. And I thought about it for a moment. What he'd watched her do, the way she'd walked through that laughter without flinching, the way she'd found Mrs. Crane's fence post and fixed it without being asked. "You won't have to do that," he said. "Build a life without being chosen. Not if you're at the Carter Ranch." He paused. "That's all I meant." He left before she could respond, and Clara Whitmore stood in Mrs. Crane's back garden with the flat rock still in her hand and felt something move through her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. Not hope. She was still too cautious for that. But the distant cousin of hope, the early suggestion of it, the faintest beginning of a door that might possibly be opening. The ranch was nothing like what she'd expected, and exactly like what the letter had described. Though the letter had been Gerald Holt's, and everything about Gerald Holt had proven to be something other than what it appeared. But Carter Ranch was real in a way she could feel the moment she arrived. The land was wide, and the cattle herd was substantial, and the working men who nodded to her from a distance as she drove up in Elias's wagon had the particular look of people who were paid properly and treated accordingly. Not desperate, not resentful, not broken, in the way she'd seen men broken by bad employers. She noticed those things. She had learned to read working conditions the way a doctor reads symptoms. The house itself was large. It had clearly been well built and had been well maintained in the ways that mattered for structure and function. But it had the particular sadness of a house where nobody had cared about comfort for a very long time. The curtains were faded. The kitchen was organized for pure utility. Nothing extra. Nothing that wasn't strictly necessary. There was no softness anywhere. "I'll show you where things are kept," Elias said, and walked her through the house with the efficient manner of a man narrating something rather than welcoming someone, and she understood from that narration more than he probably intended to tell her. He didn't live here. Not really. He occupied the house the way a person occupies a waiting room, present functional, but not settled. Not home. She understood that. She had been occupying spaces for years without being home in them. She set her suitcase in the small room off the kitchen that he showed her clean, plain, private, and she looked at the window that faced east and thought, "All right. Let's see what this is." Within the first week, she had identified 3 separate errors in the previous year's ranch accounts, reorganized the household stores so that nothing was duplicated and nothing was running out, established a working relationship with Rosario the cook that was based on mutual respect and a shared opinion about the proper way to handle kitchen inventory, and quietly fixed the latch on the back door that had been sticking badly enough that 3 of the ranch hands had been coming in through the kitchen window instead. "Who told you about the latch?" Elias asked on Friday evening when he found her testing it. "Nobody told me," Clara said. "I saw the boot prints under the kitchen window." He looked at the latch. He looked at her. "You didn't have to do that." "I know, but the boot prints were ruining the kitchen floor." There was a pause that had something in it she couldn't quite name. Elias almost smiled, not quite, but the almost was there something around the corner of his mouth. "The accounts," he said. "You found errors. 3 in last year's record and 2 in the year before. I'll have the corrections written up by Monday with documentation showing how I found them." That's significant money." "Yes," she said. "It is." He was quiet for a moment. "You said your father ran a business." "Dry goods," Clara said. "Small but busy. He taught me the accounts when I was 16 because he said a woman who doesn't understand money is a woman who can't protect herself." She paused. He was right about that, even if he was wrong about a lot of other things. "What kind of things?" She glanced at him. It was the most personal question he'd asked her. He thought a woman's life naturally organized itself around one thing eventually, that all the rest was just waiting. He meant marriage. He meant belonging to someone, Clara said. Yes. The silence stretched out between them in a way that wasn't uncomfortable, but had edges to it. Places where something could be said or not said, and the choice was being made second by second. "And you don't believe that," Elias said. "I believe a person can belong to a place," Clara said carefully. "To work. To purpose. I'm not sure the arrangement has to include another person." She looked at him. "Though I notice that doesn't stop people from assuming otherwise." "Nobody here is assuming anything," Elias said. "I know," she said. "That's why I said it the way I did." He nodded slowly. "Fair enough." She went back to the kitchen to help Rosario with supper, and she did not let herself think too hard about the way that conversation had felt. The strange ease of it. The absence of performance. The sensation of speaking to someone who was actually listening rather than waiting for their turn to talk. She did not let herself think about it, but she noticed it. The town noticed other things. By the end of the second week, Clara had accompanied Elias into Red Hollow twice for supply runs, and on both occasions she had managed transactions at the general store, exchanged information with two of the ranch hands' wives who'd been quietly struggling with overcharges from the local feed merchant, and organized a modest solution to a problem involving the church's charity fund that had been going around in circles for 3 months. She hadn't done any of this deliberately, or rather she hadn't done it as a performance. She had simply been paying attention the way she always paid attention, and where she saw a problem she could solve without it costing her anything significant, she solved it. But the town was watching. People are talking about her. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Thomas, who was too honest for his own good and seemed to know it, told Elias in a way that was clearly intended as information Elias might want to have. "Talking about her how?" Elias said, not looking up from the fence line he was repairing. "Talking about, that she's different than they thought, that she's been helping people around town." A pause. "Some of them feel bad about how they treated her when she got off the stage." "They should," Elias said. "Some of them are saying maybe Gerald Holt made a mistake." Elias looked up from the fence then. "Gerald Holt absolutely made a mistake," he said flatly. "But that's not our business." Thomas nodded and wisely did not pursue it further. What Thomas didn't report because he didn't know about it was the conversation that had happened 2 days earlier between Clara and Rosario in the kitchen at 5 in the morning when Clara had come down unable to sleep and found Rosario already at the stove with red eyes and a letter from her sister in her hand. "Bad news," Clara had said as gently as she knew how. Rosario had shaken her head at first, but then her face had crumpled, and she'd sat down at the kitchen table and told Clara everything the sister in Santa Fe with a sick child. The debt she owed the doctor, the wages she'd been setting aside for 8 months that still weren't enough. Clara had sat across from her and listened. All of it. Without trying to fix it immediately, without offering hollow reassurances, without making it about herself. Then she'd said, "The accounting errors I found in the ranch records. There may be a recovery available through the Territorial Merchant Authority. I was going to mention it to Mr. Carter on Monday. If it comes through, it means a bonus for the household staff. I can't promise anything, but I can tell you it's possible." Rosario had looked at her for a long moment. "Why would you do that?" Rosario said. "Why would you tell me that?" "Because you needed to know something might change," Clara said simply. "And because you work hard, and you deserve to." Rosario had cried harder after that, which sometimes happens when kindness arrives after a long drought of it, and Clara had sat with her until the crying stopped, and then they had made biscuits together in companionable silence as the dawn came up through the kitchen window. By the end of that week, Rosario had told every person on the Carter Ranch what had happened in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, which meant that long before the rest of Red Hollow started revising its opinion of Clara Whitmore, the people who actually saw her every day had already made up their minds. She was not the woman nobody wanted. She was the woman who made you feel without quite understanding how that someone was paying attention to the things that actually mattered about you. What Clara didn't show anyone, what she kept folded as tightly as the $43 that were now reduced to $31, kept in the private center of herself where the light didn't reach, was the fear. Not the practical fear of destitution, though, that was there. Something deeper than that. The fear that had been growing in her since long before Gerald Holt failed to appear at the stagecoach. The fear that had started in the years of her father's illness and calcified into something she couldn't name but felt constantly. The fear that this was simply who she was, not unwanted in the romantic sense, but structurally, fundamentally unbelongable. A woman who fit everywhere temporarily and nowhere permanently. Who could make a place better? She could always do that. She'd been doing it all her life, but who could never quite make a place hers. She sat with it on Thursday evenings, which was her one evening with no particular duty, when she'd take her Bible and sit in the small chair by the east-facing window and not read it, just hold it, because it had been her mother's, and it was the one object she'd carried from everything she'd lost. She sat with it, and she thought, this is good work. This is honest work. I am safe, and I am fed, and I am useful. That's more than most people get. Be grateful for what this is, and don't let yourself want more than what you can actually have. She was very good at that conversation with herself. She'd had it many times. She was less good this particular Thursday at making herself believe it, because Elias Carter had knocked on the open door of the front room that afternoon and asked if she would look at something, and she'd followed him to his study, and he'd spread the territorial survey maps across the desk and shown her where he was planning to extend the north pasture fence line, and the two of them had spent an hour bent over those maps talking about land and cattle and practical logistics, and at some point during that hour, she had realized that he was asking her opinion. Not reporting to her, not explaining to her, asking. Genuinely interested in what she thought, and she'd thought, oh, this is what it feels like to be listened to. I forgot what this felt like. And then she'd come back to her room and picked up her Bible and sat in the chair and had the conversation with herself again. This is good work. This is honest work. Don't want more than what you can actually have. But the fear had a new shape now. Not just the fear of not belonging. The fear of belonging somewhere, of beginning to recognize the particular silence of a house, and the particular rhythm of another person's days, and the particular way a man almost smiles but doesn't quite, and beginning to build something around all of that, without meaning to, without permission, and then having to lose it. That was the fear she couldn't say out loud. So she held her mother's Bible and watched the evening come down over the east pasture, and she kept the fear to herself. And in the morning, she went back to work. She was, after all, very good at carrying things alone. She had been doing it her whole life. What she didn't know yet, what neither of them knew, though it was already true, was that Elias Carter was sitting in his study on that same Thursday evening, staring at the survey maps they'd looked at together and thinking about the way she'd said, that fence line will cause you grief in the spring melt. If you move it 8 feet south, the drainage problem solves itself. Just like that. Matter of fact. Practical. Already seeing something he'd looked at for years without seeing, and he was sitting there thinking, when did I stop being alone in this house? And the answer was, somewhere around the day she fixed the latch on the back door without being asked. And he didn't know what to do with that. So he folded it carefully away, the way a man folds something valuable, when he doesn't yet know what it's for, and he went to bed, and in the morning he went back to work. The ranch expanded. The accounts balanced. The house began slowly, room by room, like a fire catching in damp wood, to feel like a home. And somewhere in the quiet space between two people who had both learned to carry things alone, something was building. Neither of them dared to name it yet. But it was there. The morning. Clara Whitmore discovered what was really wrong with the Carter Ranch accounts, not the surface errors she'd already found, but the deeper pattern hiding beneath them began with a stranger's horse outside the bank and ended with her understanding exactly how much danger they were all in. But that is what the next part of this story belongs to. The stranger's horse had been tied outside the Red Hollow Bank since before Clara arrived in town that Wednesday morning, and something about it bothered her in a way she couldn't immediately explain. She hadn't come to town for any dramatic purpose. Elias needed 3 specific items from the general store, a particular grade of fence wire lamp oil in quantity, and a medicinal salve for one of the hands who'd torn his palm open on a rusted nail, and Clara had offered to collect them while she delivered the corrected account ledger to Mr. Forsyth at the bank, who served as the ranch's financial intermediary. It was practical. It was errand running. It was the kind of morning she had come to find deeply satisfying in its ordinariness. But the horse was still there when she came out of the general store 40 minutes later. A fine animal, too fine for Red Hollow. The kind of horse that cost more than most ranchers made in a season, with a saddle that had silver fittings and a brand she didn't recognize on the left flank. And it was still tied to the bank post, which meant whoever owned it was still inside, which meant that whatever business they had with the bank was taking a very long time. Clara stood on the street for a moment. Then she went into the bank. Mr. Forsythe was behind his cage, which was normal, but his posture was wrong. He was a comfortable man in his late 50s who moved through his daily work with the settled ease of someone who had been doing the same thing for 20 years and expected to be doing it for 20 more. But right now, he was sitting very straight, his hands folded on the counter in front of him, with a stillness that wasn't calm. It was the stillness of a man who had decided not to fidget because fidgeting would give something away. There was another man in the bank. He was standing at the far end of the room near the manager's office with his back partially turned, talking in a low voice to Mr. Hines, the bank manager. Clara couldn't see his face clearly, but she could see enough expensive coat city. Cut the particular posture of a man who was accustomed to being listened to and was slightly impatient when the listening took too long. She walked up to Forsythe's cage. She set the ledger on the counter. "Good morning," she said at normal volume. Forsythe looked at her with visible relief. "Miss Whitmore, good morning. I wasn't expecting you until Friday." "Mr. Carter wanted the corrections documented before the end of the month," she said. "I found 2 additional inconsistencies in the 84 records that I've flagged. Nothing that affects the current balance, but I thought the history should be clean." She kept her voice professional and unhurried. "Is everything all right, Mr. Forsythe?" He glanced toward the back of the room, quick and reflexive, then back at her. "Of course, yes, fine." He took the ledger without opening it. "I'll review this and have a note sent out to the ranch by Friday." The man at the back of the room had turned around. How was perhaps 45, dark-haired, going silver at the temples, broad-shouldered in a way that suggested he had once been physically powerful and still believed himself to be. His face was the kind that wore confidence the way other men wore hats, habitually, constantly, in all weather. He looked at Clara with the evaluating expression of a man who assessed everything and everyone, not because he was interested, but because he was the kind of man who liked knowing the value of things. "Carter Ranch," he said. Not to Clara, but loud enough that it was clearly intended for her to hear. He said it the way you'd say the name of something you'd been thinking about. Clara looked at him directly. "I work for Carter Ranch," she said. "Can I help you with something?" The man smiled. It was a good smile, technically speaking, charming even. "I don't think so," he said pleasantly. "Just a name I know." He looked at Hines. "We'll continue this tomorrow." He put on his hat and walked out. Clara turned back to Forsythe, who was staring at the ledger in his hands, as though he was trying very hard to appear interested in it. "Who was that?" she said quietly. A pause. Too long. "Charles Whitaker," Forsythe said. "He's a cattle investor, from Chicago, I believe." "What does he want with Mr. Hines?" "I really wouldn't know, Miss Whitmore. That's not my area of the bank." Howe was lying. Not dramatically, not with any particular skill, just quietly, and with the sad competence of a man who had been told to say nothing and was doing his best with the instruction. Clara picked up her empty satchel. "Of course," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Forsythe." She walked out into the street. Charles Whitaker and his silver-saddled horse were gone. But Clara stood there for a long moment in the July heat, and she thought about the name Whitaker and the way Forsythe had held himself while that man was in the room, and the particular way Mr. Hines had looked when he came out of his office to say goodbye, which was the way a man looks when he's just been told something he wishes he hadn't been told. She did not have enough information yet. She knew that. But she had spent enough years managing a failing business to recognize the specific atmosphere that gathers around financial trouble. The careful silences, the averted eyes, the way people stop talking about numbers in public. Red Hollow had that atmosphere. She just hadn't noticed it until now. She went home and started paying closer attention to everything. That evening at supper, she asked Elias a question she'd been holding for the right moment. "Do you know a man named Charles Whitaker?" Elias didn't put his fork down, but there was a pause before his next bite that lasted half a second too long. Why? He was at the bank this morning, Clara said, talking to Hines behind a closed door. Forsyth was uncomfortable about it. Elias was quiet. Forsyth is uncomfortable about a lot of things, he said finally. Elias. She used his first name. She hadn't done that before, not directly, not like that. He looked at her. What does Whitaker want with the bank? A longer silence. Rosario was clattering dishes in the kitchen. Outside, one of the hands was calling to another across the yard. He wants land, Elias said. He's been buying up cattle operations across the territory for 3 years. Smaller ranches, first, then medium operations. He comes in when a ranch is having trouble overextended loans, a bad season legal problems, and he makes an offer at about half the real value, and the ranches take it because they don't have another choice by the time he arrives. Clara was very still. And has he approached you? Not directly. Elias set his fork down now. 2 months ago, I received a letter through a territorial land broker. Offered me 60 cents on the dollar for the ranch, the cattle, and the water rights. I didn't respond. That's why the accounts needed to be right, Clara said. She wasn't asking. She was following the logic as it assembled itself in front of her. If there were errors in the records, if the finances looked worse than they are, if the accounts showed the ranch was struggling, it would be easier to claim the land value was lower than I'd say it was, Elias said. In a legal dispute over price, whoever controls the numbers controls the argument. Clara looked at him across the table. How long have you known about the accounting errors? I suspected something was wrong about 4 months ago, he said. I didn't have the skill to find it. You should have told me that when you hired me. I know. Elias, you should have told me. I know, he said again. He looked at her steadily. I'm telling you now. She took a breath. She thought about Forsyth's posture. She thought about the silver saddle. She thought about the word water rights, which in the Montana territory was the kind of phrase that made men do terrible things. There's more, she said. Isn't there? It wasn't a question. Elias was quiet for a long moment. The north pasture, he said. The one I showed you on the survey maps. The expansion I'm planning. Yes. The water access for that pasture runs through a narrow strip of land that technically has a disputed title. The original territory survey from 1871 has 2 overlapping claims. It's been unresolved for 15 years because neither claimant has had the money or the motivation to take it to territorial court. And if Whitaker acquired that strip, he'd control access to water for 1/3 of my grazing land, Elias said. I couldn't operate without it. I'd be forced to sell. The silence between them was different now. Not the quiet ease of 2 people who had grown comfortable in each other's company. This was the silence of a problem that had just become fully visible. Why didn't you fight the title 15 years ago? Clara said. Because 15 years ago the ranch was barely solvent, and I was 23 and my wife was still alive, and I had about 40 things more pressing than a survey dispute. He paused. And because I assumed it would sort itself out. Things like that don't sort themselves out, Clara said. They sit quiet until someone with enough money decides to use them. I know that now. All right. She folded her hands on the table. She made herself think systematically rather than urgently, which was the discipline her father had drilled into her. Emotion tells you something is wrong. Reason tells you what to do about it. The original survey documents, where are they? Territorial Records Office in Helena. And the competing claim, who holds it? A family named Prewitt. The father died about 8 years back. I don't know if there are heirs who've maintained it. We need to know, Clara said. If the claim has lapsed, the land reverts to territorial status, and you can file a clean title. If there are heirs, we need to find them before Whitaker does. Elias looked at her for a moment with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not surprise exactly. Something more complicated. As though he'd known she was capable of something and had just seen the proof of it, and it was larger than he'd expected. You've done this before, he said. Legal documentation. My father had a boundary dispute with a neighbor for 6 years, Clara said. I spent 2 of those years corresponding with the territorial office and tracking original survey chains. We won because I found an 1863 land grant that predated the neighbor's claim by 9 years. She met his eyes. I know how to read these documents, Elias. Let me help. I was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen sounds had stopped. Rosario was either done or listening. I hired you to manage the house and the accounts, Elias said slowly. You hired me because you needed someone who could think, Clara said. You told me as much that first day. Don't tell me now that you meant something smaller than what you needed. Elias Carter, the quietest man in Red Hollow. The man who had spent 6 years running a successful ranch largely through the application of patience and silence. Looked at Clara Whitmore across his supper table, and for the second time since he'd known her, the almost smile moved around the corner of his mouth. No, he said. I didn't mean something smaller. Then let me work. All right, he said. Yes, all right, Clara nodded. I'll write to Helena in the morning, and I want to go through every record you have from the last 5 years. Not just the financial accounts, but the land correspondence, anything from territorial offices, any letters from brokers or surveyors, everything. That's boxes of paper, Elias said. I'm aware. It'll take weeks. Then I'd better start tomorrow, Clara said. And she went back to her supper with the practical calm of someone who had just accepted a large assignment and was already organizing its execution in her mind. What she didn't show him what she kept turned away from the part of herself that Elias Carter was apparently able to read more easily than most people, was the thread of fear running underneath all that practical calm. Not fear of Whitaker, not really. Fear of something more specific. She had come to this ranch for work. She had found the work genuine and the man honorable. She had begun carefully, with the systematic caution of someone who had learned to be careful to believe that this place was real, that the respect was real, that the way he listened to her was real and would continue to be real. And now there was a man named Whitaker circling the edges of all of it, and Clara knew enough about men like that to know they didn't stop circling until they got what they wanted or someone stopped them. She was going to stop him, not for her own sake. That was what she told herself. But she sat with the Bible that night, and she knew in the honest part of herself she couldn't argue with that. It wasn't entirely true. She was going to fight for Carter Ranch because it was the right thing to do. Yes, but she was also going to fight for it because it was the first place in years that had felt in the smallest possible way like somewhere that could be hers. And she was not ready to lose that. She was absolutely not ready. The letter to Helena went out Thursday morning. By Friday, Clara had worked her way through 4 years of ranch correspondence and found the first thing that made her stop breathing for 3 full seconds. It was a letter. Not from Whitaker. From a law firm in Helena, dated 14 months ago, addressed to Elias Carter, and marked with a territorial seal. It concerned the Prewitt land claim. The letter said that the Prewitt heirs there were 2 of them. Daughters of the original claimant had retained legal representation and were prepared to assert their father's claim to the disputed strip. The letter further stated that if the matter was not resolved through territorial arbitration within 12 months, the firm intended to file in federal district court. The letter was 14 months old, which meant the 12-month window had already closed, which meant the filing could already have happened. Clara sat with the letter in her hands and thought very carefully about what that meant. If the Prewitt heirs had filed in federal court, there would be a public record. If there was a public record, Whitaker's people could find it, may already have found it. May have found it before Elias did. A man with Whitaker's resources and the right legal team could approach the Prewitt heirs with an offer for their claim. A generous offer far more than the land strip was worth to 2 women who didn't run cattle and acquire it quietly and legally, and then wait. Wait until Elias needed to expand north. Wait until the water access question became critical. And then walk in with a document showing he owned the land between the Carter Ranch and the only viable water source for the North Pasture, and make his offer, and this time Elias wouldn't be able to say no. She went to find Elias. I was in the East Barn, with Thomas going over the condition of the cattle that were due for the fall drive. She walked in and said his name from the doorway, and something in her voice brought him to her immediately, leaving Thomas mid-sentence without explanation. She handed him the letter. She watched his face as he read it. "You didn't know about this," she said. "No." His voice was flat. "I never saw this letter. It came 14 months ago. Where does your mail go when you're out on the range?" Forsyth takes it at the bank and holds it for me. He looked up. "I was up north for 3 months last year. The Dixon grazing leases were expiring, and I was renegotiating. Forsyth knows to hold anything important." Clara said very carefully, "How close is Forsyth to Hines?" The silence that followed was the loudest silence she had heard in weeks. Elias's jaw set. "They've been friends for 20 years, he said. "And how long has Whitaker been corresponding with Hines?" Another silence. She could see him working through it the same way she had worked through it, following the logic wherever it went, even when it went somewhere he didn't want to follow. "I don't know," he said, "but I intend to find out." "Elias." She put her hand on his arm without thinking about it, and then was briefly aware of having done it, but didn't move her hand. "We need to find the Prewitt heirs before we do anything else. If they've already sold the claim, then we need to know that before we make any other move," he said. "Yes." He looked at her hand on his arm. He didn't move either. "How do we find them?" "The law firm's address is on the letter," Clara said. "I'll write to them today. I'll also write to the federal courthouse in Helena if a filing was made. There's a public record, and I can request it." She paused. "And you need to talk to Forsyth." "I know." "Not accusingly," she said. "Not yet. We don't know what he's done or why. He may have genuinely mislaid the letter. But we need to understand whether he's Whitaker's man before we tell him anything else." Elias looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment, in the particular way he had that she had come to recognize, the way of a man who was choosing very deliberately what to say next. Not because he was evasive, but because he had learned through hard experience that words meant things, and he didn't say them without meaning them. "Clara," he said. "Yes. What you're doing, what you've found, what you're building toward this, is not part of what I hired you for." "No," she said. "I want you to know. Elias." She met his eyes directly. "Don't thank me yet. We don't know how bad this is." "I know how bad it could be," he said. "I know exactly." A beat. "I also know that 4 months ago, when I suspected something was wrong, I couldn't see the shape of it. I had the facts, and I couldn't see what they were telling me." He paused. "You walked into this ranch 3 weeks ago, and you can already see the whole thing." She didn't look away. "My father's doctor called it a gift for pattern recognition," she said. "I called it what happens when you spend enough years cleaning up messes other people made." A small pause. "I'm sorry, that sounded bitter." "It sounded honest," Elias said. "There's nothing wrong with honest." Her hand was still on his arm. She became aware of it again, fully aware of it, the warmth of it, the fact that she had put it there without calculating, and he had not stepped back. She moved it quietly back to her side. "I'll write the letters this afternoon," she said. She went back to the house. She sat at the small writing desk in the study, Elias's study, where he'd spread the survey maps out, and asked her opinion, and she wrote 3 letters with the precise formal language she'd learned from territorial correspondence, and she sent them out with Thomas on the Friday mail run, and she went back to the archived records and kept reading. She found the second thing that stopped her cold on Saturday morning at 6:30, before Rosario had the coffee ready. It was not a letter this time. It was a notation in the margin of a ledger from 3 years earlier. A small notation penciled almost invisible in handwriting she didn't recognize, not Elias's, not the previous account keeper's. 7 digits that didn't correspond to any transaction on that page, and a name, Meridian Land. She had heard that name before. She had heard it exactly once in passing, from one of the hands' wives in town, who had mentioned it in the context of a neighboring ranch that had sold the previous winter, a ranch that had been doing well, and then suddenly wasn't, and whose owner had taken less than half its value because, as the wife had put it, something went wrong with the water access and they couldn't prove it wasn't their fault. Meridian Land. Clara wrote the name down. She wrote the 7 digits beside it. She sat with the ledger in her lap and felt the shape of the thing coming clearer, not fully visible, not yet, but closer. the way a figure emerges from fog as you walk toward it. Whitaker wasn't just buying distressed ranches, he was creating them. She was still sitting with that thought when she heard boots on the porch steps and then Elias's voice at the study door. "You've been in here since before sunrise," he said. "I saw the lamp." "Come look at this," she said. He came in. She showed him the ledger and the notation. She showed him the name. She told him what she knew about the neighboring ranch and the water access problem. She watched his face as the same understanding arrived in him that had arrived in her. "He manufactured the problem," Elias said. "I think so. I don't have proof yet." She tapped the margin notation. "But whoever wrote this was in your records, Elias. They were inside your accounting books, which means someone with access to your records was either already working for Whitaker or was paid to give him information." The silence was total. "Someone on my ranch," Elias said. "Or at the bank," Clara said. "Your records go through Forsyth. Forsyth shares them with Hines. Hines meets privately with Whitaker." She let him sit with the progression. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything yet, but we have to consider it." Elias straightened. His voice when it came was very controlled. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to act normally," she said. "Don't confront Forsyth. Don't change your behavior at the bank. Don't tell anyone what I've found." She met his eyes. "Can you do that?" "For how long?" "Until I have enough to take to the territorial court myself," she said. "A week, maybe 2. Elias looked at her for a long moment. "You understand what you're doing," he said. "If Whitaker knows someone on the ranch is looking into his business." "He won't know," Clara said. "I'm the housekeeper doing the accounts. Nobody pays attention to that." A pause that held something dry and not quite bitter. Being underestimated has its uses. And there it was again, the almost smile further around the corner than usual, closer to becoming something real. "You are not what I expected," Elias said quietly. "No," Clara said. "I never am." She went back to the records. She was still working at noon when a horse came fast up the ranch road, and Thomas knocked on the study door with his hat in his hands and an expression that meant something had gone wrong. "There's a man at the gate," Thomas said. "Sent a rider ahead. Says he's coming to see the ranch. Says Mr. Carter would know his name." Elias appeared in the doorway behind Thomas. "What name?" Elias said. "Whitaker," Thomas said. "Charles Whitaker." Clara looked at Elias. Elias looked at Clara. She closed the ledger. She put it under the stack of household account books out of sight, indistinguishable. "Tell him to come in," she said before Elias could speak. She stood up and smoothed her skirt and looked exactly like a housekeeper who had been doing paperwork all morning. "And Thomas, if he asks, I've been working on the October supply order. That's all I've been doing." Thomas looked from her to Elias. Elias nodded once. Thomas went. "You don't have to be here for this," Elias said to her. "Yes, I do," Clara said. "I need to see how he looks at you. I need to hear how he talks about the ranch." She looked at him steadily. "I'll be quiet. I'll stay in the background, but I need to be in the room." A pause. "All right," Elias said. She moved to stand near the far wall half behind the doorframe to the hall where she'd be visible if looked for, but not central, not obvious. She listened to the hoofbeats coming up the road. Charles Whitaker was coming to Carter Ranch, and he had no idea that the woman he was about to walk past, the quiet, plain-dressed woman doing household accounts in the background, was the person who had already begun to unravel everything he had built. He had no idea, and Clara intended to keep it that way, for exactly as long as she needed to. Charles Whitaker rode in like a man who already owned the place. That was the first thing Clara noticed. Not his clothes, not his horse, not the 2 men he'd brought with him who stayed near the gate with the careful stillness of people paid to watch things. It was the way he moved through the yard, looking at the barn, the cattle pens, the well, the outbuildings, looking at them. The way a buyer looks at inventory he's already decided to purchase. Not assessing value, confirming it. She stood inside the doorframe to the hall still as furniture, and she watched him come in. Elias met him in the front room, with the particular controlled courtesy of a man who had decided in advance to give nothing away. He shook Whitaker's hand. He gestured to a chair. He did not offer coffee, and Clara noticed that, and suspected Whitaker noticed it too. "Carter," Whitaker said, settling into the chair with the ease of a man who made himself at home in other people's houses as a matter of professional habit. "Good to finally meet you in person. I've been hearing about this operation for years." "Mr. Whitaker," Elias said. He sat across from him and did not lean back. "I didn't expect a visit." "I was in the territory on other business," Whitaker said pleasantly. "Thought I'd stop in. I hope that's not an imposition. It's a long ride for a social call." Whitaker smiled. The same smile Clara had seen outside the bank, good technically speaking, and completely empty of anything genuine behind it. "Let's not pretend we don't both know why I'm here. I sent you a letter through the land broker. You didn't respond." "I didn't respond because I'm not interested in selling," Elias said. "Every man's interested in selling at the right price. Some men aren't." A small pause. Whitaker looked around the room with that appraising ease. His gaze passed over Clara, standing in the background near the hall, a ledger in her hands entirely forgettable, and moved on without stopping. "Good," she thought. "Keep looking past me. Keep." "I've heard good things about your operation," Whitaker said. "Good cattle, well-managed land, strong workers. You've built something real here. Carter and I respect that." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and his voice shifted to something that was meant to sound like honesty. "Which is exactly why I want to talk to you before the situation becomes more complicated." Elias said nothing. He was watching Whitaker the way a man watches a horse he doesn't trust. Not aggressive, not frightened, just absolutely attentive. "The North Pasture," Whitaker said. Clara's hands tightened on the ledger. "What about it?" Elias said. "The water access question, the disputed strip." Whitaker spread his hands. "I'm sure you're aware of the Prewitt claim. It's a matter of territorial record." "I'm aware of it," Elias said. "Then you're also aware that the 12-month window for voluntary arbitration has passed." Whitaker's voice was still pleasant, still reasonable, the voice of a man doing someone a favor. "Which puts that land question in a very uncertain position, legally speaking." "Uncertain for who?" Elias said. "For anyone who needs clean title to operate," Whitaker said. "For a ranch that depends on North Pasture water rights for a third of its grazing capacity." A beat. "I'm offering you a way out of that uncertainty, Carter. I'm offering you a clean exit before the legal situation deteriorates." The room was very quiet. Clara was doing something that looked like reviewing figures in the ledger. She was actually listening to every word, watching every shift in Whitaker's posture, tracking the gaps between what he said and what he meant, the way she had learned to track the gaps in her father's business correspondence years ago, the place where the real information always lived. "What's your interest in the Prewitt claim?" Elias said. The smile didn't move. "I like clean titles. In my experience, disputed land makes for complicated business." "Has your experience included the Prewitt claim specifically?" The smallest pause, less than a second. "I've looked into it, yes, as part of my due diligence on this territory." "And what did your due diligence tell you?" "That the situation is more complicated than it appears," Whitaker said. "Which is why I'm here, Carter. I'm not your enemy. I'm offering you a fair price for an asset that's going to become harder to sell the longer this goes on." Elias looked at him steadily. "What price?" Whitaker named a number. It was Clara calculated instantly, approximately 58 cents on the dollar for the ranch's demonstrated value, before accounting for the full cattle inventory, and before accounting for the water rights themselves, which he was apparently planning to acquire separately through the Prewitt claim and not include in the purchase at all. She kept her face entirely neutral. "I'll think about it," Elias said. "I'd encourage you not to think too long," Whitaker said pleasantly. "Circumstances have a way of changing the arithmetic on these things." "Is that a warning?" Elias said. "It's an observation." Whitaker stood. He was a tall man, and he used the height with the ease of long practice. "I'll be in the territory for another 3 weeks. The offer stands until I leave." He walked toward the door. He passed Clara without looking at her. He stopped. He turned back, and this time he looked at her directly, and something in his face shifted a small recalibration, a renewed attention. The look of a man whose peripheral vision has caught something he decided to examine more carefully. "You're the woman from the bank," he said. "Wednesday morning." Clara met his eyes. "I work for Mr. Carter," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. "Household accounts." "Whitmore," he said slowly as though remembering. "You came from Virginia." "I did." He looked at her for a moment with the same appraising expression he'd used on the barn and the cattle pens. "Gerald Holt's loss," he said lightly, and smiled again, and walked out. The door closed behind him. Clara and Elias stood in the silent room and listened to the hoofbeats moving back down the ranch road. Then Elias turned to her. "He's already talked to the Prewitt heirs," Clara said before he could speak. "Yes, or he's planning to within the next few days. That's why the 3-week window. He's giving himself time to close the land deal first, so when he comes back with the real pressure, he has the water rights as leverage." She set the ledger down on the nearest table. "And Forsyth knew about the Prewitt letter, Elias. I'm certain of it now. Whitaker knew about the 12-month window. He knew it had closed. The only way he knows that is if someone told him specifically when the letter arrived and what it contained." Elias's face had gone to stone. "Forsyth has been with this bank for 15 years. I know. He was a friend of Margaret's family. I know." Clara kept her voice level and not unkind. "I'm sorry." He walked to the window and stood with his back to her. His shoulders were rigid under his shirt. He was breathing carefully the way a man breathes when he is very angry and has decided not to let the anger make his decisions. "What do we do?" he said. "We move faster than he does," Clara said. "I need to go to Helena." He turned. "Helena. The federal courthouse. The Prewitt filing, if it exists, is there. The survey records are there. And the Prewitt heirs, their law firm's address is on the letter. And if I go in person, rather than waiting for correspondence, I can talk to them directly." She met his eyes. "I can offer them fair value for the claim before Whitaker gets to them. But I need to know what we're working with before I can structure anything. That's a 3-day journey each way." "I know. And you'd go alone." "I'd go as your representative," she said, "with your written authorization for the land title negotiations and access to the territorial records." A pause. "Unless you intend to come yourself." Elias was quiet for a long moment. "If I leave the ranch now, the hands will notice. Whitaker may have someone watching for exactly that. If he knows I'm going to Helena, he'll move faster." "Yes," Clara said. "That's why it should be me." The silence stretched. "You've been here 5 weeks," Elias said. Not as an objection, as a fact he was examining. "I have," Clara said. "I'd be sending you to Helena alone to negotiate a land claim and access federal court records on behalf of a ranch. You've worked for 5 weeks against a man with substantially more legal resources than either of us." "Yes," Clara said. "That's correct." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why would you do that?" She thought about the honest answer. She thought about the Thursday evenings with the Bible, and the fear, and the shape this place had begun to take inside her. She thought about what it would cost her to say any of that out loud. "Because it's right," she said. "And because I can." Elias was quiet for 3 full seconds. "I'll write the authorization tonight," he said. She left for Helena the following morning. Thomas drove her to the stage depot in Red Hollow before sunrise, and she sat in the pre-dawn dark with her satchel of documents and her notebook, and $40 of Elias's money tucked inside her boot, alongside what was left of her own, and she watched the dark shapes of the Montana Territory move past the window as the stage pulled out, and she thought about what she was riding toward. The stage made the journey to Helena in 2.5 days, and Clara spent most of it reading and rereading the documents she'd brought, mapping the paper trail she could see, and the gaps where paper should have been and wasn't. By the time they arrived, she had a list of 17 specific things she needed to find organized in order of importance and probability of success. She went to the law firm first. The firm was called Aldrich & Byrne, and it occupied the upper floor of a building on the main commercial street, and the clerk at the front desk looked at Clara Whitmore, travel-worn, plainly dressed alone, with the politely suppressed impatience of a person who had decided before she opened her mouth that she was not a significant client. "I represent Carter Ranch," Clara said, and placed Elias's written authorization on the desk. "I'm here concerning the Prewitt land claim and the correspondence your firm sent to Mr. Carter 14 months ago." The clerk read the authorization. His expression shifted by approximately 3 degrees in the direction of attentiveness. "I'll see if Mr. Aldrich is available," he said. Mr. Aldrich was a compact man in his early 60s, with the watchful eyes of someone who had spent decades reading situations quickly and accurately. He read the authorization. He read it twice. He looked at Clara. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "my clients have recently received an approach from another party concerning the Prewitt claim." "I know," Clara said. "That's why I'm here in person, rather than by post. The other party has made a financial offer. Has it been accepted?" A pause. "Not yet," she breathed. "Then I'd like to speak with your clients directly." "That would be highly irregular, Mr. Aldrich," Clara said. "A man named Charles Whitaker is buying land across this territory at half its value by manufacturing legal uncertainty around water rights and survey disputes. He has been doing it systematically for 3 years. 2 Prewitt daughters who are trying to fairly resolve their father's estate are about to be paid a fraction of their claim's real worth. Not because they lack rights, but because they don't know what those rights are actually worth to the people who need the water." She folded her hands on the desk. "I would like to tell them. I think they deserve to know." Mr. Aldrich looked at her for a long time. "Come back tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, he said. The Prewitt daughters were named Edna and Ruth, and they were in their late 30s and early 40s, respectively, and they had driven 2 hours from their current residence to sit in Aldrich's office and look at the woman who had asked to speak with them directly, and their expressions held the particular wariness of people who had been handled carefully by lawyers for 2 years and were tired of it. Clara recognized it immediately. She had sat on that side of careful lawyers herself. She told them the truth. Not all of it. Not Forsyth. Not the margin notation. Not the things she didn't yet have proof for, but the core of it. The water rights. What they were worth to a ranch like Carter's. What Whitaker paid for similar claims in similar situations, and what the real territorial market value was. She laid it out in plain language the way her father had taught her to present numbers to people who were being asked to make a decision based on them. Edna sat very straight through all of it. Ruth took notes in a small book. When Clara finished, Edna said, "How do we know you're telling us the right value and Whitaker isn't?" "You can verify every number I've given you through the Territorial Land Office," Clara said. "It's all public record. I'll write down the specific records and exactly where to find them." She looked at them steadily. "What I can offer you is the full fair value of the claim paid on completion of a clean title transfer with a recorded easement that protects your survey right. Your father's name stays in the permanent record." Ruth's pen stopped. Edna said quietly, "Whitaker didn't mention anything about keeping the name in the record." "No," Clara said. "He wouldn't." The silence in the room was different now, less guarded, more human. "We'll speak with Mr. Aldrich," Edna said. "Can you give us until this afternoon?" "I can give you until tomorrow morning," Clara said. "But I need an answer before I leave Helena." She went to the federal courthouse while she waited. The filing was there. The Prewitt case had indeed been entered in the federal district court docket but not yet assigned a hearing date, which meant it was in the queue and moving slowly. That was good. Slow was manageable. What was not good was the second document she found. It was a notice of interested party filed 3 weeks earlier. A legal entity claiming potential interest in the outcome of the Prewitt case. The entity was called Meridian Land Holdings. Clara stood at the clerk's counter with that document in her hands and read it 3 times. Meridian Land, the name from the margin notation in the Carter Ranch ledger. She had been right. This wasn't just about Carter Ranch. Meridian Land was Whitaker's legal vehicle, the entity he used to acquire disputed claims before his personal name appeared anywhere in the transaction. He had already filed his interest in the Prewitt case before approaching Elias, which meant the visit to the ranch had never been a genuine offer. It had been reconnaissance. He'd come to see what Elias knew and what he didn't. And he had looked past Clara Whitmore entirely. She asked the clerk for the complete filing history of Meridian land holdings in the territorial court system. The clerk looked at the scope of the request. "That'll take some time to compile," he said. "I'll wait," Clara said. She waited 4 hours. She used them to write a detailed letter to Elias, coded in the language of household accounts, so that if it was intercepted in transit, it would read as routine ranch correspondence. She was particularly careful about the Forsyth section. She still had no direct proof, only inference, and she would not accuse a man in writing without proof. But she described the Meridian land connection in terms she knew Elias would understand, and she described what she was planning to do next. The filing history when it arrived was 23 pages long. Clara sat in the corner of the courthouse anteroom with the pages in her lap and read all 23 of them with the systematic attention of a woman who had learned that the devil lived in the details other people didn't have the patience to read. She found it on page 17. A transaction from 2 years earlier. A land claim acquisition through Meridian Land Holdings in the northern Montana Territory for a property adjacent to a ranch called the Henderson operation. The Henderson Ranch had sold 6 months after the transaction at, according to the public sale record, on the facing page, approximately 52 cents on the dollar. And the witness signature on the Meridian land transaction was a name she recognized. Thomas Forsyth, listed as a notary witness. Forsyth hadn't just withheld a letter. He had actively participated in a previous Meridian land transaction. He was not a passive instrument. He was a working part of the mechanism. Clara sat with that knowledge for a full minute, not moving. Then she folded the pages carefully, put them in her satchel, thanked the clerk, and walked out. She had what she needed. Not everything, not yet, but enough. Enough to take to the territorial court. Enough to establish a pattern. Enough to make Whitaker's approach to Carter Ranch look like what it was, the latest instance of a documented scheme. She went back to Aldrich's office. Edna and Ruth Pruitt were still there. "We want Carter Ranch to have the claim," Edna said when Clara walked in, "at the fair value you described, and we want our father's name in the record." Clara sat down. "I'm glad," she said. And because she was tired and had been sitting in a courthouse for 4 hours and had just found proof that a man she'd trusted had been working against the ranch, she let herself be glad for exactly 3 seconds before she moved on to the next thing. "I'll need your attorney to draft the transfer agreement today," she said to Aldrich, "and I'll need a copy of the complete Prewitt survey documentation to take back with me." "Today is ambitious," Aldrich said. "Yes," Clara said, "but it needs to be today." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he called his clerk. She had the signed transfer agreement and the survey documentation by 8 o'clock that evening. She was on the first southbound stage the following morning. She had been in Helena for 47 hours. She was halfway back to Red Hollow when it occurred to her what she had just done. Not the logistics of it, she'd been tracking those the whole time, but the weight of it. She had traveled alone to a territorial capital and negotiated a land title transfer and found documentation of a financial conspiracy and organized it all into a package that could be taken before a court. And she had done it in 47 hours, starting from nothing except a 14-month-old letter and a margin notation in a ledger. And then she thought about what would happen when she got back, because getting back with the documents was one thing, using them was another. Whitaker had resources and lawyers and a banking contact embedded inside Red Hollow's financial system. Exposing Forsyth would cause an earthquake in a town where he had operated for 15 years. And Whitaker himself, a man with Meridian land filings and 23 pages of court documents, would not simply accept being outmaneuvered by a ranch housekeeper and the quiet rancher who'd hired her. He would push back. He would push back hard. And she didn't yet know exactly how. She pressed her forehead against the stage window and thought about Elias. About the way he'd looked when she left, standing in the yard in the pre-dawn dark, watching the wagon take her toward town. Not waving, not calling after her, Just standing there with that contained, controlled stillness that she had come to understand was not coldness, but the opposite. The thing a man does with feeling, when he has learned not to trust that feeling will be safely received. She understood it because she had spent the better part of her adult life doing the same thing. She thought about what he'd said the evening before she left. He'd come to the study while she was organizing the documents, and he'd stood in the doorway for a moment before saying anything, and she'd waited. "Take the extra $40 from the household account," he'd said. "Not as an expense, just take it." "I have sufficient funds," Clara had said. "I know you do," he'd said. "Take it anyway." She had looked at him across the room. "Why?" He'd been quiet for a moment. "Because I'd rather you had more than you need than less," he'd said. That's all. It wasn't what he meant. They both knew it wasn't the whole of what he meant. But it was all he said, and she had taken the $40, and now she sat on the stage with the documents in her satchel and Elias's money still in her boot alongside her own. And she was aware with the bright, uncomfortable awareness of something she'd stopped being able to manage into a smaller size, that she was going back to that ranch because she wanted to. Not because she had nowhere else. Not because she needed the work. Because she wanted to walk through that door and show him what she'd found and watch the expression on his face when he understood what it meant. Because she wanted to sit across the table from him at supper and hear what he thought. Because somewhere in the last 5 weeks, Carter Ranch had stopped being a temporary arrangement. And that terrified her in a way that Charles Whitaker, with all his legal maneuvering and silver saddles, simply did not. She was 3 hours from Red Hollow when the stage slowed unexpectedly. She heard the driver call down to someone on the road. She heard another voice respond, male, unhurried, with the tone of a man who expected to be listened to. The stage stopped. Clara kept her hand flat on her satchel. The door opened. It was one of Whitaker's men. Not Whitaker himself, the heavier of the two who'd stayed near the gate at the ranch, the one with the watchful eyes. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had been sent to deliver a specific message. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Whitaker would like to speak with you." Clara looked at him steadily. "Mr. Whitaker knows where Carter Ranch is," she said. "He's welcome to make an appointment." "He'd prefer to speak now." "I'd prefer not to," Clara said. "Is there something specific he'd like you to relay?" The man studied her. "He says to tell you that you've been to Helena." Her heartbeat did not change. Her face did not change. She had spent enough years managing difficult situations to know that the moment you showed a reaction was the moment you lost ground. "I've been to Helena," she said evenly. "On ranch business, as Mr. Carter's authorized representative. That's entirely within my rights." She met the man's eyes. "Tell Mr. Whitaker that if he has concerns about Carter Ranch's business affairs, he's welcome to address them through the appropriate legal channels." A pause. "He thought you might say something like that," the man said. "Then he should have expected this conversation to be brief," Clara said. "Good afternoon." She pulled the stage door closed. Her hands were steady. She was extremely proud of that. The stage moved. She sat with her satchel in her lap, and she thought about Whitaker's face when he received that message, and the particular kind of man who stops being charming when he stops getting what he wants, and what that kind of man was capable of. And she thought about the 23 pages in her satchel, and the signed transfer agreement, and the Forsyth signature on the Meridian land document, and she thought, "Come on then, I'm ready." She was 20 miles from Red Hollow and coming home. Thomas was waiting at the stage depot when Clara stepped down, and the look on his face told her before he said a single word that something had changed while she was gone. "Mr. Carter sent me," Thomas said, taking her satchel before she could object. "He said to bring you straight back. Don't stop in town." "What happened?" Thomas glanced around the depot. 2 men Clara didn't recognize were leaning against the wall of the feed store across the street, not talking to each other, not doing anything in particular, just present. "Whitaker's people have been in town since yesterday," Thomas said quietly. 3 of them. "They've been asking questions at the bank, at the general store, at the boarding house." He paused. "Mrs. Crane told one of them you'd gone to Helena on ranch business. She didn't mean any harm by it." "I know she didn't," Clara said. She was already moving toward the wagon. "What else?" Forsyth closed early yesterday. Hines went with him to a meeting at the hotel. The men who work at the station saw Whitaker come out of that meeting looking satisfied. Thomas helped her up to the seat and climbed up himself. And this morning Mr. Carter got a legal notice delivered to the ranch. Clara looked at him. What kind of notice? A demand for accelerated loan repayment. 30 days. Thomas clicked the horse into motion. The bank is calling in the operating credit early. Says there's been a material change in the ranch's financial condition that triggers the early repayment clause. Clara sat with that for exactly 3 seconds. There's been no material change, she said. No, ma'am, Thomas said. There hasn't. Which means they manufactured one, she said. Or they're claiming to have found one in the records. She thought about the corrected ledgers, the errors she'd identified and documented. Someone could take those same errors before her corrections and argue they represented a pattern of financial instability rather than a bookkeeping problem. It would be a lie. But it would be a documented lie, and in a territorial court, a documented lie required documented rebuttal, which was exactly what she was carrying in her satchel. She pressed her hand flat against the leather and felt the papers inside and thought, not yet, but close. Elias was waiting on the porch when the wagon came up the road. He didn't pace. He didn't come running out to meet her. He stood at the top of the porch steps with his arms at his sides and watched her come, and she could see from 50 yards away the particular set of his shoulders that meant he had been managing something difficult and was still managing it. She was down from the wagon before Thomas fully stopped it. I know about the notice, she said, reaching him. Thomas. Yes. Are you all right? He looked at her for a moment. The question clearly surprised him. He had been running through logistics in his head. She could see it, and the question cut across all of that and landed somewhere more personal than he'd been prepared for. I'm functional, he said. That's not the same thing. No, he agreed. It isn't. Come inside. They went to the study. Clara opened her satchel on the desk and laid the documents out in the order she'd organized them on the stage survey records, the Prewitt transfer agreement, the Meridian land filing history, the Henderson transaction with Forsyth's witness signature. She talked him through all of it without stopping. Not because she was anxious, but because he needed the complete picture, and she had learned that the way to give a sharp person a complete picture was to lay every piece down and let them see the whole shape at once, rather than feeding it to them in stages. Elias didn't interrupt. He picked up each document as she described it, read it, set it down. His face was very still through all of it. The particular stillness she had come to understand meant he was integrating information, filing it, drawing connections. When she laid down the Forsyth signature page, he went very quiet. He looked at it for a long time. He witnessed the Henderson transaction, Elias said. 2 years ago, before the Henderson ranch sold at 52 cents. He's been doing this for at least 2 years. At least, Clara said. Possibly longer. The Meridian land filing history goes back 4 years, but not every transaction shows the same witness. Forsyth appears in 3 of the 11 I found. Elias set the page down. He stood with both hands flat on the desk, looking at the spread of documents, and Clara waited. She had learned to wait for him not out of deference, but because his silences had content in them, because the thinking that happened in them was real and worth the time. The accelerated repayment notice, he said finally. 30 days. We can fight it, Clara said. The trigger clause requires documented evidence of a material change. The errors in the accounts were bookkeeping errors. I have the correction. Documentation showing they were pre-existing inconsistencies, not evidence of financial instability. And the loan itself. She pulled another paper from the satchel. I requested the original loan agreement from the Territorial Lending Archive in Helena. There's a clause in it, Section 11, that limits early repayment demands to situations involving actual default or demonstrated insolvency. Neither applies. Elias looked up from the documents. You got the loan agreement from the archive. I requested it while I was waiting for the Prewitt transfer to be drafted, Clara said. I thought it might be relevant. He looked at her with that expression again, the one she'd seen the morning she showed him the Prewitt letter, the one that meant what he was observing was larger than he'd anticipated. But there was something else in it now, something that hadn't been there before, something that went past professional appreciation into territory she didn't let herself name. "Clara," he said. "The 30-day clock started this morning," she said, because she needed to stay on the logistics, or she would start feeling things that were too large for this desk and this room and this moment in the middle of a crisis. "Which means we have 30 days to file a legal challenge to the notice and present the Prewitt transfer to clear the title question. Once the title is clean, the primary leverage Whitaker has on the land value argument disappears." "And Forsyth." She met his eyes. "That's more delicate. What he did may be criminal, the witness signature on a fraudulent scheme, the withheld letter. But accusing a man of that in a town where he's been trusted for 15 years requires more than a signature on a single document. We need a formal complaint to the Territorial Banking Authority, and we need it backed by the full Meridian land filing history." She paused. "That complaint needs to come from you. And it needs to come through a lawyer in Helena, not through anyone local." "Because anyone local is a risk," Elias said. "Yes." He straightened. He moved away from the desk toward the window and stood with his back to her for a moment. When he turned back, his face had settled into a decision. "Write the letter to Helena tonight," he said. "I'll sign whatever you need. We'll send Thomas with it on the first morning stage." He looked at her steadily. "And I need you to understand something. All right. What you've done, what you found in Helena, what you did with the Prewitt daughters, what you're doing right now. I know what this cost you. I know you went alone, and you managed all of it alone, and you did it for this ranch." He stopped. He started again more carefully. "I don't know how to repay that." "You don't repay it," Clara said. "It isn't a debt." "Then what is it?" She thought about Thursday evenings, and the Bible, and the fear. She thought about 20 miles from Red Hollow and coming home, and the word she had used without deciding to use it. "It's just what you do," she said, "when a place matters to you." The silence between them was very full. Elias took a breath. He seemed to be working toward something, choosing the words the way he chose all words, with the deliberate care of a man who had learned that imprecision caused damage. But before he could speak, Thomas knocked hard on the study door. "I'm sorry," Thomas said from the doorway. He was breathing fast. "Whitaker's here. He's got 2 men with him, and a man I don't know who's carrying a leather document case. They rode up the North Road." Clara and Elias looked at each other. "The North Road," Elias said. "Not through town. So he doesn't want witnesses to whatever he's about to do," Clara said. She looked at the documents on the desk. She made a decision in 3 seconds. She stacked the papers, put the Forsyth signature page and the Meridian land history at the bottom of the pile, and placed the household account ledgers on top, so the arrangement looked like routine bookwork. "Let him in," she said to Thomas, "and stay where you can hear." Thomas went. Elias moved toward the door, then stopped and looked back at her. "Whatever he says," Clara said quietly. "Let me hear all of it before you respond. Don't give him a number. Don't agree to anything. Don't react to whatever he claims. Just listen." "I know how to negotiate," Elias said. "I know you do," she said. "But he's not here to negotiate." She moved to the far side of the study, took a position near the bookshelf, where she had a clear sightline to the front room, and picked up the household ledger. The picture was the same as his first visit, the housekeeper doing accounts. Unremarkable, forgettable. She heard the door. Whitaker came in with 2 of his men and the third figure, a thin man in his 50s with city clothes and a lawyer's careful posture, carrying a document case, who looked at Elias with the expression of someone accustomed to delivering bad news at close range. "Carter," Whitaker said. He didn't extend his hand this time. "I understand you received our notice this morning." "I received something," Elias said. He stood in the center of the room with his hands easy at his sides. He had the particular physical calm of a man who had done physical work all his life and did not need to manufacture stillness. "I'm not sure I'd call it yours." "The bank sent it on our recommendation," Whitaker said. "Given the material concerns in the accounts." "There are no material concerns in the accounts," Elias said. "I'm afraid our review suggests otherwise." Whitaker nodded to the thin man who opened the document case and produced a bound set of papers. "This is a formal assessment of the Carter Ranch financial position, prepared by a certified territorial accountant." It identifies a pattern of accounting irregularities going back 3 years that, in our view, represents— Who conducted the assessment? Elias said. A firm from Helena, Meridian Financial Consulting. Clara kept her eyes on the ledger. She did not look up. She kept her breathing even. Meridian Financial Consulting. A consulting arm of the same entity as Meridian Land Holdings. A certified accountant producing an assessment designed to support an accelerated loan call, using errors that had been planted in the records by someone with access to those records, confirmed by a bank intermediary who had already participated in the same scheme twice before. It was elegant, she thought. If you had no conscience, it was genuinely elegant. I'll need to review that assessment, Elias said. Of course, Whitaker said, and handed it over with the ease of a man giving something he expects to be taken back. We're prepared to discuss a resolution today. Given the circumstances, I'm willing to extend my offer by a modest additional amount to account for the time pressure the loan situation creates. He named a new number. It was 61 cents on the dollar, 3 cents higher than the previous visit. Generous enough to seem like movement, small enough to still be theft. The loan, Elias said. You're saying if I accept your offer, the loan notice goes away. The loan would be assumed as part of the purchase, Whitaker said. You'd walk away clean. No debt, no legal complications, no uncertainty about the title question on the north pasture. And if I don't accept, Whitaker's expression was still pleasant, still reasonable. Then the loan notice stands, the title dispute proceeds in federal court, and you'll spend the next 18 months fighting a legal battle that I suspect will cost more than the ranch itself. He paused. I'm not your enemy, Carter. I'm giving you a way out. You said that last time, Elias said. Last time you had more options, Whitaker said. Today you have fewer. Clara turned a page in the ledger. Both men looked at her. She did not look up. Then she said without inflection, Mr. Carter, would you like me to pull the January loan agreement, the original? A beat. Please, Elias said. She went to the desk. She did not take the original loan agreement from the satchel. She knew it by memory now. She took a clean sheet of paper from the desk drawer, wrote a single line on it, and carried it to Elias. It said, Section 11. Show him. Elias read it. He looked at Whitaker. The loan agreement has a Section 11, he said. Limiting early repayment demands to situations of actual default or demonstrated insolvency. Neither applies to this ranch. The thin lawyer's expression shifted. Barely perceptibly. But Clara was watching for it, and she saw it, the fractional recalibration of a man who has just been told something he hadn't planned for. That clause is subject to interpretation, the lawyer said. It's subject to a territorial judge's interpretation, Elias said, which I'm happy to seek. Whitaker was looking at Clara now. Not the way he'd looked at her before, not the peripheral dismissive glance of a man registering and discarding. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at the barn and the cattle pens when he first rode in. Assessing. Recalibrating. You've been to Helena, he said to her directly. I mentioned that to your man on the road, Clara said pleasantly. Ranch business. The Prewitt heirs had a meeting with their attorney last Thursday, Whitaker said. The day you were in Helena. I wouldn't know anything about that, Clara said. It was not technically a lie. She didn't know what Edna and Ruth had done after she left Aldrich's office. She only knew what had been signed before she arrived. Whitaker's jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough. The Prewitt claim is central to the water access question, he said. If it's been resolved in a direction that doesn't favor, we can discuss the Prewitt claim in court if that's where it's heading, Elias said. His voice was very level. Along with the Henderson transaction, and the Meridian land filing history, and the specific financial arrangements between your consulting firm and the territorial banking system. The room went entirely quiet. The thin lawyer closed his document case. Whitaker looked at Elias for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara, and she met his gaze without flinching, without performance, with the plain direct steadiness of someone who had laid her cards on the table and was entirely comfortable with what she was holding. This conversation isn't finished, Whitaker said. No, Elias agreed. It isn't, but it is finished for today. Whitaker left. The two men with him followed. The thin lawyer went last, and at the door he paused and looked back at Clara with the expression of someone who is filing information for later use. She looked back at him with the expression of someone who has already filed considerably more. The door closed. Thomas appeared from the hallway. He had heard every word. "Thomas," Elias said without turning, "get your horse. I need that letter to go to Helena tonight, not in the morning." "Yes, sir." Thomas disappeared. Elias turned around. Clara was standing at the desk with her hands braced against it, and for the first time since she'd stepped off the stage, she let herself breathe. Really breathe, the kind that acknowledges that the last 20 minutes were as dangerous as they felt. "You told him about the Henderson transaction," she said. "Yes. We don't have everything we need to fully support that in court yet." "I know," Elias said. "But he doesn't know what we have and what we don't." She looked up at him. "You were bluffing." "Partially," he said. "The Prewitt transfer is real. The loan agreement clause is real. The Meridian land history is real." A pause. "The Henderson implication is real, it's just not yet documented to the standard we need," Clara said. "Yes, I know." She pressed her fingers against the desk. "He's going to move fast now. We've shown him we know more than he expected. He'll try to get to Forsyth before we file the complaint." "Then we file tonight," Elias said. "I need 2 more hours to write it properly." "You have 2 hours," he said. "I'll keep Thomas." She sat down at the desk. She pulled the papers out of the satchel and began organizing them in the sequence that would build the strongest legal case. Meridian land history. First, then the Henderson signature, then the Prewitt connection, then the loan manipulation, then the accounting irregularities with her corrections attached. Elias stayed in the room. He didn't pace. He didn't hover. He simply stayed sitting in the chair near the window, quietly present in the way that she had come to find. She would not say essential. She would not let herself say essential, but the way that she had come to find real. She wrote for 90 minutes. At the end of 90 minutes, she had a 6-page complaint addressed to the Territorial Banking Authority and the Federal District Court, fully documented, clearly argued with specific reference to the relevant statutes and the specific evidence she was enclosing. She read it back once. She handed it to Elias. He read it in 8 minutes. He read slowly but completely, which she had also come to know about him. He did not skim, he did not rush. He gave every word the attention it required. "This is good," he said. "It's thorough," she said. "Whether it's good depends on the judge." He looked at her over the document. "You wrote this in 90 minutes. "I've been building it in my head since Thursday," she said. The writing was just the final step. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why do you do that?" "Do what?" "Make yourself smaller than you are." He said it without accusation, just as a plain observation. "You just built a legal case in 47 hours that took down the primary leverage of a man who's been running this scheme for years, and you describe it as a final step." Clara looked at him. "Because if I get it wrong," she said quietly, "I don't want to have claimed more than I delivered." "And if you get it right?" She didn't answer immediately. "If I get it right," she said, "then the ranch is safe, and you have clean title, and Whitaker goes somewhere else to do his damage." She looked back at the documents. "That's enough." "Is it?" Elias said. The question sat in the room between them. She was very aware suddenly of how close they were sitting, both at the same desk, not touching, but close enough that she could hear him breathing, close enough that when she looked up, she would be looking directly into his face. She looked up. He was already looking at her. There was something in his face that she had not seen there before. Not the almost smile. Not the controlled patience of a man choosing his words. Something more open than that. Something that had stopped choosing and was just present. Looking at her the way he'd looked at her the first day in the street, but without the careful distance, without the measured reserve. Just directly and honestly, and with a quietness that felt like the quietness after a long-held breath is finally released. "Clara," he said. The front door banged open. Both of them moved she back from the desk, he toward the hall, with the reflexive alertness of people who had just spent 2 weeks in a state of managed tension. It was Rosario, not one of Whitaker's men. Rosario with her coat still on and her face flushed from coming in from outside fast. "There are people coming up the road," Rosario said. "Not Whitaker's men, townspeople." She caught her breath. "A lot of them." Elias and Clara looked at each other. They went to the door. There were 11 people coming up the ranch road on foot and horseback, and Clara recognized most of them, the hands' wives she'd spoken to in town, the minister from the church, whose charitable fund she'd helped untangle 2 of the older ranchers from the eastern properties, the woman who ran the milliner's shop. At the front of the group, moving with the determined stride of someone who had made a decision and intended to see it through, was a woman Clara knew slightly from the general store counter. Her name was May Alderton, and she was perhaps 60, and she had the particular physical confidence of a woman who had survived 40 years of frontier life and was not easily alarmed. "We heard what Whitaker's people have been doing in town," May said without preamble, stopping at the foot of the porch steps and looking up at Elias. "Asking questions, digging up dirt, trying to build a case against your books." She crossed at her arms. "Henderson sold because nobody stood up for them in time. We're not making that mistake again." Elias was very still. "What are you offering?" he said. "Whatever you need," May said simply. "Witnesses to how this ranch operates. Testimony about Forsyth's habits at the bank. Whatever it takes to fight this in the right place." She looked past Elias to Clara, and her expression shifted, not soft exactly, but honest. "We didn't treat you right when you came off that stage, Miss Whitmore. And from what I've been hearing, you've been working to save this town's largest employer since your first week here, without any of us knowing." She paused. "We're here to do better." Clara stood in the doorway and looked at the 11 people in the road, and she felt something move through her chest that she recognized as what happened when the fear you've been carrying turns out to be partially unnecessary. Not all of it. Not yet. There was still Whitaker and the court, and 30 days, and Forsyth's reckoning, and all the complicated machinery of what came next. But this was real. She stepped out onto the porch beside Elias. "Come inside," she said. "All of you. We have a great deal to tell you, and we don't have time to waste." They came in. Rosario, without being asked, started the coffee. And Clara Whitmore stood in the front room of Carter Ranch, with 11 people who had come through the dark to stand beside them, and she talked. She explained what she'd found and what they needed and how it was going to work. She was direct and clear, and didn't soften the difficulty of it, because these people hadn't come out of sentiment. They'd come out of practical solidarity, which was more durable, and they deserved to know what they were agreeing to. Elias sat at the edge of the room and listened. Occasionally he answered a question. Mostly he watched her, the way she managed 11 different personalities in one room, the way she answered the skeptical questions without getting defensive, the way she gave the older rancher enough information to feel competent without overwhelming him with detail. He watched her, and he thought about the street in July, the white knuckles on the suitcase handle. "I suppose I will have to build a life without being chosen." And he thought, "I have been watching you build a life every single day since you arrived, and you have been doing it so quietly that you haven't noticed what you've actually built." She had built this. These people in this room. This ranch that felt like a home for the first time in 6 years. This fight that was actually winnable. She had built all of it without asking for credit, without counting the cost, without once making it about what she needed rather than what needed to be done. By 9 o'clock that evening, Thomas was on the road to Helena with the legal complaint and 6 signed witness statements from the people who had come up the ranch road. By 10 o'clock, the house was quiet again. Clara was still at the desk finishing a final document notation when Elias came back into the study. She heard him stop behind her. She finished the line she was writing. She set the pen down. She turned around. He was standing close, not intrusively close, but close in the way of a man who has crossed a threshold he had been standing at for a long time. "You should sleep," he said. "You've been traveling for 4 days. I'll sleep when this is done. It's done enough for tonight." She looked at him. He looked at her. The study was quiet, except for the fire and the distant sounds of the ranch settling into night. "Elias," she said. "I know," he said, which was not an answer and was also somehow an answer. She looked at his face open in that way she'd seen at the desk, the way that had nothing calculated in it. The way of a man who had stopped managing the distance. "We don't know how this ends yet," she said carefully. "No," he said. "We don't. Whitaker isn't finished. Forsyth still has to be faced. The court filing could take months." "I know all of that." "So this—" She stopped. She tried again. "Whatever this is, we can't let it—" "Clara." His voice was very quiet. "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm not asking you to do anything with it." He paused. "I just need you to know that when I offered you work that first day, I thought I was helping someone who needed a place to stay. And somewhere between the fence latch and the survey maps, and tonight, another pause longer. I stopped being sure which one of us was being helped." The room was very still. She looked at him for a long moment. "I fixed the latch because the boot prints were ruining the floor," she said. The almost smile came all the way around the corner. Became for the first time completely real. "I know," he said. "That's not what I meant, and you know it." "Yes," she said softly. "I know." She turned back to the desk. She gathered the final documents into the satchel, buckled it, set it by the door for morning. "Good night, Elias," she said. "Good night, Clara," he said. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed with her mother's Bible in her hands, and she did not have the conversation with herself about not wanting more than she could have. She just sat with it. The wanting and the fear and the fact that for the first time in years, both of them were pointing toward the same place. Outside Carter Ranch was quiet and vast and entirely real under the Montana stars. And 30 days were already running. The territorial hearing was set for the 22nd day of the 30-day window, which left 8 days of margin that Clara refused to feel comfortable about. She had learned in the weeks since Thomas rode to Helena with the complaint that comfort was the enemy of preparation. Every time she felt the case was solid, she went back through the documents and found one more thread to pull, one more gap to close, one more potential argument. Whitaker's lawyers could make that she hadn't yet prepared an answer for. Elias watched her do this with the patient attention of a man who understood thoroughness and did not confuse it with anxiety. How was right to let her work? Because on the 15th day, 4 days before the hearing, the third thing happened that none of them had anticipated. Gerald Holt came to Carter Ranch. Clara was in the study when Thomas knocked and said there was a man at the gate asking for her specifically, and when she heard the name, she sat very still for a moment before she said, "Bring him in." Gerald Holt was shorter than she'd imagined. She realized she'd never constructed a physical image of him. He'd been a name in letters, a man who'd sent Barker across the street with an errand and absence. In person, he was perhaps 45 thick through the middle, with the particular redness of a man who drank more than was good for him, and whose face showed it in the small broken capillaries across his nose and cheeks. He came into the front room with his hat in both hands and the expression of someone who had rehearsed an apology and was already losing confidence in it. Clara stood in the doorway to the hall and looked at him. She had thought occasionally about what she would feel if she ever encountered Gerald Holt. In the first weeks after arriving in Red Hollow, the thought of him had carried a particular sting. Not heartbreak, because she had never been close enough to heartbreak over a man she'd never met, but something in the category of humiliation. The specific injury of being assessed and found wanting by someone who hadn't had the decency to look at you first. Standing here now, looking at the actual Gerald Holt, she felt almost nothing. A mild curiosity, a remote recognition. She had been too busy to maintain the injury. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Holt," she said. He turned his hat around in his hands. "I know I have no right to be here." "You're right about that," she said pleasantly. "But you're here, so you might as well say what you came to say." He looked at the floor, then up at her. "I heard what you've been doing. About Whitaker and the bank and the whole business." A pause. "The whole town's heard it." "I assumed they would." "I want—" He stopped. He tried again. "I came because I want you to know that what I did the day you arrived, I'm not proud of it." Clara waited. "I'd heard things," he said. "From the letter broker before you came. Rumors about your background. That you'd been caring for a sick father for years, that you had no money, no property. Some of the men I knew said a woman like that. A woman who'd had nothing but hardship. He stopped again. I was a coward, he said. That's the truth of it. I decided you weren't what I wanted without ever looking at you. She looked at him for a long moment. Mr. Holt, she said, I think you should know that what you did that day was the best thing that happened to me in a very long time. Just not in the way you intended. He blinked. Ma'am. You sent me to find my own way in this town, Clara said. And the way I found turned out to be considerably better than the one you were offering. She said it without cruelty, just as a plain statement of fact. I don't need your apology, but if it helps you sleep better, I accept it. He stared at her for a moment. Then something went out of his face. The rehearsed quality, the braced expectation of a harder reception, and he nodded slowly. Whitaker made me an offer once, he said. On my own cattle, 2 years back, I took it. He looked at her directly now. I didn't know then what he was doing. I didn't ask the right questions. I just took the money and told myself I got a fair deal. A pause. I didn't. Clara went still. How much do you remember about the terms? She said. Enough, he said. If you want it, I'll write it down. She got him a pen and paper, and he sat at the kitchen table and wrote for 20 minutes. And what he produced was not elegant, but it was detailed dates. Figures the name of the Meridian entity that had been on his transaction, the lawyer who'd represented it, the bank officer who'd facilitated it. Hines. Not Forsyth this time. Hines directly. Clara read it through twice. She looked up. Mr. Holt, she said, would you be willing to sign an affidavit to this effect before the territorial hearing? He looked at the paper he'd just written. He looked at her. He looked like a man who had come to make a small personal gesture and was being offered an opportunity to do something considerably larger and wasn't entirely sure he was equal to it. Yes, he said after a long moment. I would. She had him sign it before he left, witnessed by Thomas and Rosario, and she added it to the case file that evening with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned to take useful things wherever they appeared without asking why they'd arrived. Elias read it before dinner. He said, Gerald Holt. Yes, Clara said. He came here to apologize to you and ended up giving you Hines. He came here to apologize, Clara agreed. What he gave me was a consequence of the apology. She looked at the file. We have Forsyth on the Meridian Land Witness documentation. Now we have Hines directly in a transaction. Together, they established that the bank's participation in Whitaker's scheme wasn't incidental, it was structural. That changes what we can ask for in the hearing, Elias said. Yes, it does. He looked at her. What can we ask for? Dismissal of the loan repayment notice with prejudice. A full review of the bank's lending conduct under territorial authority. And damages. She met his eyes. Not just protection of the Carter Ranch. Damages for the interference. For the manufactured accounting assessment. For the pattern of conduct. She paused. It won't be easy. Whitaker has better lawyers than we do. We have better facts than he does, Elias said. Yes, she said. We do. They looked at each other across the desk, and the look had something in it that had become familiar to both of them over the last 3 weeks. The particular communion of two people who had been working toward the same thing for long enough that the working itself had become a kind of intimacy. Not the dramatic intimacy of declarations and gestures, but the deep practical intimacy of people who trusted each other with the real things. She had stopped being careful about feeling it. She wasn't sure exactly when that had happened. The night before the hearing, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in the narrow bed in the room off the kitchen and stared at the ceiling and went through the case file in her head for the 11th time, checking each argument against each potential counterargument, finding the seams, reinforcing them. She was not afraid of losing, or rather she was, but the fear was productive now, the kind that sharpened rather than paralyzed. What kept her awake was something else. After the hearing, whatever happened, there would be an after. And she had not let herself think about the after. She had kept her focus on the 30-day window and the documents and the legal case and the ranch, because those were the things she could control and manage and move toward concrete resolution, and the after was something she could not yet see the shape of. If the hearing went their way, Carter Ranch would be safe. The Prewitt title would be clear. Whitaker would retreat. Forsyth and Hines would face a banking authority review. And Clara Whitmore would be what the housekeeper who had managed the accounts and handled a legal crisis. That was the formal arrangement. That was what she'd agreed to. But she had been in that study for 2 months now, with a man who listened to her the way no one had listened to her since her father was well, and she had been in this house that had been warming around her the way a house does, when someone inside it starts caring about it, and she had quietly, without deciding to, started believing it was real. The question she hadn't asked because she was afraid of the answer was whether real and permanent were the same thing. She picked up her mother's Bible in the dark. She didn't open it. She thought about what Elias had said in the study. I stopped being sure which one of us was being helped. And the look on his face when he'd said it, the look with nothing managed in it. She thought about what she wanted. For once, without the careful architecture of practical limits and reasonable expectations, she thought about what she actually wanted. And when she thought about it honestly without protection, it was this. This house, this work, this man who almost smiled for 3 weeks before he finally did. This life that had somehow assembled itself around her in the same natural and inevitable way that she had fixed the fence latch and organized the kitchen stores and balanced the books. Not because anyone told her to, but because it was the thing that needed doing, and she was the person who could do it. She wanted to stay, not because she had nowhere else to go, because she wanted to stay. That was the simplest and most terrifying thing she had thought in years, and she sat with it in the dark until the sky outside her east-facing window began to lighten, and then she got up and made coffee and packed the document case for the hearing. The territorial hearing was held in the Red Hollow Meeting Hall, which served as the town's court space when the circuit judge came through. Judge Alderman was 63 spare, with the manner of a man who had seen most things that could be shown to a judge in 40 years and was not easily moved by performance. He was, Clara had learned from the older rancher who'd come to the ranch the night of the community gathering, a man who valued precise documentation over eloquent argument. She had prepared accordingly. Whitaker arrived with 3 lawyers. Clara had read about the lead one, a man named Prescott from a firm in Chicago that specialized in territorial land acquisition in the Meridian land filing history. He was excellent. She respected that in the way you respect a difficult obstacle, without softening your intention to go through it. Elias sat beside Clara at the respondents' table. May Alderton and 4 of the community witnesses sat in the front row behind them. Gerald Holt sat in the 3rd row with his hat in his lap, looking like a man who had decided to do something right and was committed to it regardless of the discomfort. Forsyth was not present. Clara had been told through Thomas that Forsyth had taken ill that morning. She suspected the illness was of the moral variety, and had begun approximately when he'd learned the scope of the complaint against him. The hearing opened with Prescott presenting the accelerated loan notice and the Meridian financial assessment of the Carter Ranch accounts. He was smooth and thorough, and he built his case with the practiced ease of a man who had run this particular play before in different territories. Clara sat with her hands folded on the document case and listened to all of it. Judge Alderman looked at the financial assessment. He looked at it for a long time. This assessment was prepared by Meridian Financial Consulting, he said. That is correct, Your Honor, Prescott said. And the loan notice was issued on the bank's recommendation. At the recommendation of the reviewing parties, yes. And the reviewing parties have a financial interest in the outcome of any forced sale of the Carter Ranch. A beat. Just a small one. But Clara felt it. The party's interest in the outcome is, a yes or no will do, Counselor, Judge Alderman said. Another beat. Yes. The judge made a note. Continue. When Prescott finished, Clara stood. She did not have a lawyer's training. She had $43 in her boot and a document case and 20 years of watching her father argue with anyone who tried to take something from him. She presented the case in the order she had built it. The original loan agreement and Section 11. The corrected account records with the full documentation of the pre-existing errors and their correction. The Prewitt transfer agreement with Edna and Ruth's signatures, establishing clean title to the water access strip. The Meridian Land Filing History. 23 pages entered as evidence. The Forsyth witness signature on the Henderson transaction. Gerald Holt's affidavit naming Hines directly. She presented each document clearly and without dramatics, identifying what it showed and how it connected to the document before it. She built the picture the way she had built every accounting record she'd ever managed, systematically, completely leaving no gap that someone could push a false claim through. Prescott objected 4 times. Judge Alderman sustained 1 and overruled 3. When Clara finished, she sat down. Elias looked at her. He said nothing, but his hand resting on the table between them moved a fraction of an inch toward hers. She did not move away. Judge Alderman looked at the documents in front of him for a long time. The room was absolutely silent. Whitaker at the opposing table had the careful stillness of a man who was very good at not showing what he was feeling and was currently working hard. "I'm going to ask some questions," the judge said. He asked 12. Clara answered 11 of them. Elias answered 1 about the specific grazing arrangement on the north pasture, which was the one detail she'd left to him because he knew it better from the working side than she did from the records. At the end of the questions, Judge Alderman looked at Prescott. "Do you have documentation showing a genuine material change in the Carter Ranch financial position, independent of the Meridian financial assessment?" Prescott consulted with 2 of his colleagues in a rapid low exchange. "We would need additional time to compile. The 30-day window is a function of the loan agreement," the judge said, "not of anyone's preparation schedule." He looked back at the documents. The Meridian financial assessment was prepared by an entity with a direct financial interest in the outcome of this matter. I am not inclined to accept it as independent evidence of the trigger condition. He paused. The Section 11 clause appears to apply on its face. "I am dismissing the accelerated loan notice," Clara breathed. "Regarding the Meridian Land Holdings conduct and the banking arrangements identified in this complaint," the judge continued, "I am referring the matter to the Territorial Banking Authority for a full review of the bank's lending practices over the relevant period, with specific attention to the accounts and conduct of Mr. Forsyth and Mr. Hines." He looked at Whitaker directly. "Mr. Whitaker, I would strongly suggest that your organization's activities in this territory receive the benefit of competent legal counsel before any further land acquisition approaches are made. I will be watching." Whitaker held the judge's gaze for exactly as long as a man can hold a judge's gaze when the judge has just said that, and then he looked away. The hearing closed. The room broke into noise, the community witnesses standing May Alderton saying something emphatic to the woman beside her. Gerald Holt letting out a long breath in the 3rd row. Prescott gathered his documents with the quick, clean efficiency of a professional who had lost and was already calculating the next move. Whitaker stood. He looked across the room at Clara. She met his eyes. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not anger, not pleasantness, not the performing confidence of a man running a scheme. Something more honest than any of that. The look of a man who has just understood fully what he was looking at and what he had underestimated. Then he put on his hat and walked out. His lawyers followed. The room kept moving around them, but at the respondents' table there was a moment of stillness. Clara and Elias sitting side by side with the noise of the room happening around them, and between them, a quiet that was entirely different from all the previous quiets. Not the quiet of something unspoken. The quiet of something that had been said in the accumulation of all the days before this one, and was now simply settled. "It's done," Elias said. "The banking review will take months," Clara said. "And Forsyth and Hines still have to face—" "Clara," he said. She stopped. "It's done," he said again. "Not the legal case, not the 30-day window. Something else. The something else that had been building since July." She looked at him. May Alderton appeared at her elbow, gripping her arm with the firm warmth of a woman who had decided that a certain amount of physical affirmation was appropriate to the occasion. "You brilliant girl," May said. "You absolute brilliant girl." "The documents did the work," Clara said. "The documents didn't ride alone to Helena and talk 2 sisters into trusting a stranger," May said firmly. "Take the credit." Clara laughed. It surprised her, the laugh sudden and genuine and lighter than anything she'd felt in weeks, and she felt Elias turn toward the sound of it, the way a person turns toward warmth. People came to shake her hand. The older rancher, the minister, the two hands' wives. Gerald Holt, who came last holding his hat and shook her hand without speaking, and she nodded to him, and that was sufficient. By the time the meeting hall had emptied, it was mid-afternoon, and the drive back to the ranch was long enough that they would arrive in the early evening, which meant the day was not quite done, but the largest thing in it was. Thomas drove. Elias and Clara rode in the back of the wagon with the document case between them and the Montana Territory opened out wide around them, the way it always did, enormous and indifferent and entirely beautiful, if you were the kind of person who could be available to beauty on a difficult day. They didn't talk much for the first mile. Then Elias said, "When I offered you the work that first day at Mrs. Crane's boarding house." "Yes," she said. "You asked me why I was offering it to you specifically." "Yes." "I told you I'd drawn my own conclusions." He was looking at the road ahead, not at her. "That wasn't the full answer." She waited. "The full answer is that I watched you stand in that street," he said. "When Barker delivered Gerald's message, I watched you receive that and not break and pick up your suitcase and walk through it. And I thought I didn't have the word for it then, but I thought that was a person." He paused. "Not a situation to solve. Not someone to help. A person." He looked at her now. "I'd stopped thinking about people that way. I'd been thinking about the ranch and the cattle and the accounts and getting through the season and doing the same next season, and I'd forgotten somewhere in there that there was a difference between a life that functions and a life that means something." The wagon moved. The sky was going gold at the edges. Clara looked at his face. "Elias," she said carefully, "I need to ask you something directly." "All right." "The arrangement we have. The work. The house." She kept her voice steady. "Is that what this is, or is it something else?" He turned on the wagon seat to face her fully. "It's something else," he said. "It's been something else for a long time. I think you know that." "I know it," she said. "I've known it for weeks. I just needed to hear you say it plainly because I have been very carefully not letting myself believe it, and I can't keep doing that if it's actually true." "It's true," Elias said. She looked at him. She felt the fear still there, still present, the deep structural fear that she was not the kind of person who got to keep the things she wanted, and she looked at it honestly, the way she looked at everything honestly, and she decided that the fear was not a better guide than the evidence. The evidence was this man, this ranch, this life that had assembled around her over 10 weeks and felt in every practical and impractical way like the place she was supposed to be. "All right," she said. "All right." He raised an eyebrow. "All right," she said again. "I believe you." Something broke open in his face. Not dramatically, not in the theatrical way of stories told for effect. Just opened. The last of the careful reserve, the managed distance, the 6 years of a man who had organized himself into something solitary because it was safer and was now quietly and irreversibly unorganizing. He reached over and took her hand. She let him. They rode back to Carter Ranch with the evening coming down around them, and his hand warm around hers, and Thomas very studiously watching the road ahead, as though the view were extraordinarily interesting. Rosario had supper ready when they arrived. She took one look at both of them and turned back to the stove with the satisfied expression of a woman whose expectations have been confirmed. The hands came in from the fields, and the evening went. The way evenings went on the ranch, the work of it, the noise of it, the realness of it, and Clara moved through all of it, feeling for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, like someone who was not passing through but had arrived. Not at the end of something. At the beginning. 2 weeks after the hearing, the Territorial Banking Authority suspended both Forsyth and Hines pending the full review. Whitaker's lawyers filed 3 separate motions attempting to limit the scope of the investigation, and the judge denied all 3. The north pasture fence went in on the 1st of September, 8 feet south of the original line, exactly where Clara had said it should go from the beginning. On a Saturday evening, in the 3rd week of September, Elias came to find her in the garden she had been quietly building in the east side of the yard since her 3rd week at the ranch. tomatoes, late-season greens, a row of herbs that Rosario had requested, and that Clara had planted partly for Rosario, and partly because planting things is something you do when you intend to be somewhere long enough to see them grow. He stood at the edge of this garden for a moment and watched her work. "There's something I want to give you," he said. She looked up. He held out his hand. It was a ring, not a diamond, no pretense of city wealth, no performance. A simple silver band made by one of the ranch hands who had, it turned out, learned silver work from his grandfather and had been doing it quietly in the evenings for years. It was clean and plain, and it fit her hand perfectly, which meant Elias had paid attention to her hands, which she found she minded about very much. She looked at it in his palm. "This isn't a business arrangement," she said. "No," he said. "It's the opposite of a business arrangement." She looked up at him. "When I arrived in Red Hollow," she said, "I thought I would have to build a life without being chosen." "I know," he said. "I heard you say it. You told me I wouldn't have to." She looked at the ring and then at him. "You were right. Clara Whitmore," Elias Carter said quietly, on a September evening in the garden she had planted with the Montana sky going enormous and dark above them, and the ranch alive around them in every direction. "You were never unwanted. You were just waiting for someone with enough sense to see you." She looked at him for a long moment. This man, this life, this real and ordinary and extraordinary thing. "Yes," she said. Not yes, she would take the ring, though she held out her hand for it. Not just yes to him, though, that was the most important yes. Yes to the garden she had planted. Yes to the accounts balanced, and the fence latch fixed, and the Prewitt sisters' father's name in the permanent record. Yes to Rosario's coffee, and Thomas's loyalty, and 11 people who came up the road in the dark because they had decided to do better. Yes to the woman she had been the whole time before Gerald Holt failed to appear before the stagecoach, before Virginia, before all the years of carrying things alone. The woman who could walk into any room and see what needed doing, and do it, the woman whose hands were strong, and whose mind was sharp, and whose heart, it turned out, had never once been the problem. Yes to all of it. He put the ring on her hand. She kept her eyes on his face. And in Red Hollow, Montana territory, in the year of 1886, the woman they had called Unwanted came home. Not to a place that chose her at last, to a place she had built with her own hands from nothing but the courage to stay.